while there has been a lot of progress in treating diseases, there is much more concern about long-term health effects and quality of life, because it depends on our food supply. And our concern is really, is the food really free of chemical or toxic substances that might affect our health? Most of the food that we depend on today is really our favor for animal protein. Most people really, we need protein for ourselves in nutrition. We didn't need to eat meat, but this is worldwide a preference of people to have meat as a food. And most of our meat is derived from a diet of corn and soybean. So animals are fed a mixture, as it is shown here, of about 15% soy protein, and most of the diet is consisting of cornmeal, which is mainly carbohydrates. So for us to, or for the animals that grow, it's essential to supplement corn because it's lacking, a proper protein content. And therefore, the production of corn worldwide and soybeans is really directed to support the growth of animals. Here I have a little bit of a diagram showing, what sort are the main crops worldwide and how much is produced. And you can see that for a long time wheat was the major crop because it is the source for making bread and noodles, chapati, and so on. But it has been overtaken by maize simply because of the desire of meat. And it's even surpassing rice. And although soybean has a smaller influence, but as I showed you earlier, the percentage of soybeans is used to fortify the diet with proteins. A major concern that I think is heavily overlooked by the media in terms of food production is really several important facts. One is excessive irrigation. I will show you very soon a slide with a few metrics. And you will see what significant aspect irrigation is. We worldwide waste too much water for cultivating crops. An example here in the former Soviet Union is the Baikal Lake. Because the water from the two main rivers, one is Dnieper, I guess, Dnieper, were used for the cotton production in the former Soviet Union. And it was, particular cotton needs a lot of water. And another example is the Nile, because Egypt is using a lot of water from the Nile for cotton production. Furthermore, think about this in terms of water rights. You have several other countries that draw water from the Nile. It's not only Egypt. So if these countries really start using water for cultivation, it's a big problem for Egypt. Another one is the industrialization. Unfortunately, a lot of the valuable land that can be used to produce crops is used for development. Roads, to drive cars, and for urban development. And it has a major impact on the amount of arable land. Now, coming back to what I said earlier about the water, I could have carried out a little quiz here, but I saved this. 1 pound of grain requires 1,000 liters of water. So you can see what one of the limitations, the biggest limitation is for production. 1 pound of poultry or fish requires 2 pounds of grain. So that's a very efficient process if you think about it. To convert the plant protein into animal protein illustrated that particular poultry is one of the most efficient sources. 1 pound of pork requires 4 pounds of grain. So we can see if you have a society that prefers let's say pork or poultry, it has a major impact on water consumption. Now, the most expensive meat is beef. Probably doesn't surprise you. 7 to 8 pounds of grain. Now, besides water consumption, the major concern I think I have is the use of chemicals for yield production or higher yields that could be affected by pests, by plant pests like insects or so that reduce the amount of crops that can be produced. And what you see here, what is frequently used is that in order to cover the entire area that is grown in an efficient way, you have planes that spray these insecticides or these chemicals. Another one is tilling. I don't know how many of you know what tilling means, but if crops are started in the spring, or seeds are germinated in the spring, you have to get rid of the weeds. Otherwise, the weeds grow faster than your crops. So that has been done usually by tilling, which means you go over the surface of the arable land and you cover the weeds. But that can lead to losing valuable soil for growing the crops. So it's both soil and the use of chemicals, which is another concern. Another one is chemicals with long half-life. So some of the insecticides that are used, they have a long half-life. They're not turned over in the soil that quickly. And so that could get into the groundwater that you consume. And although you think the food products that you get to you on your table in the evening has not seen any chemicals, still the water that you drink that comes out of faucet could be carrying some low levels of contamination. That's why in many countries there is a need to survey the water, how much contamination occurs. Another concern is in suburban areas when you have people growing their lawns outside and they want to have a very nice green lawn, they put fertilizer on. And that fertilizer also gets into groundwater and could affect, the quality of the water you drink. Yet there is another one, growth enhancers. And so what happens a lot is that the farmers that grow the animals that we for our source for meat, they mix into the diet growth enhancers or antibiotics. And the effect of that is, the animals are not sick. They're not putting it in because they have an infection. But what surprisingly results out of this, empirically, one has observed that mixing these antibiotics for healthy animals into the feed enhances their growth, probably because it has some support for the immune system. And the result of that is that tons of antibiotics are getting into the environment. And as a consequence, drug resistances arise. And these drug resistances then have an effect for physicians that want to treat patients with infectious diseases with antibiotics, and then they can't do it because these strains, pathogenic strains, are already resistant to antibiotics. There have been several attempts in the United States to fight this and ban antibiotics in the consumption of for animals, but it has been difficult to achieve proper regulation so far. Another one, which is a concern that actually I think was maybe the reason that in Europe this whole fear of GMO has arisen, was the use of dead animal meat for feeding animals because of a disease called mad cow disease. I don't know how many of you know about this. So what I want to tell you in this brief section is direct your attention not only in crop production, but how meat is produced, and all the aspects that are associated with this are much greater concern for us than really growing the crops. In order to really provide us with enough food worldwide, and with the growing population that we have worldwide, imagine, since I was born, the world population has doubled. And so there is and think about also the industrialization has risen the demand on high quality food, that in turn accelerates the need for crop production. And so I think we really are forced to invest in developing new crop varieties in order to meet these demands. And I think it is unthinkable without additional breeding that we can produce with the amount of land and the amount of water that we have sufficient food for everybody, unless we come up as scientists with new crop varieties. Now, I don't know how much you people have read in newspapers and the media about what a gene is. So I think I make a very short explanation so that you can understand what a GMO or genetically modified organism is. So a gene consists of a substance called DNA, and the DNA is a universal genetic code. We have it, the animals have it, of course the plants have it, and also microorganisms have DNA. And DNA, when the genetic code is sort of read, we call this as scientists transcription. And that makes a copy of the DNA. It's called RNA. Okay. And then there is a third step that is called translation, where the RNA is converted into something that is called a protein. most of the cases. So it's the proteins that are important for you to understand what we are driving at to introduce as new traits into crops. So actually, when you think about it, the civilization, this is, probably hard to say, it's an Assyrian relief from 870 before Christ, showing artificial pollination of date palms. But actually, civilization, as it is today, exists about 10,000 years because of agriculture. So about 10,000 years, people started to cultivate plants for the purpose of storing food. Of course, when you think about this, how nature has been used for this purpose, seeds have been an ideal source for food. Why? Seeds harbor all the energy that we need, carbohydrates, proteins, in a dormant state. Without that, you need a refrigerator. Because the seeds are perfectly developed to survive many, many years without any loss of function. When you germinate a seed, then all these functions are revitalized. So seeds are in a dormancy, and that was very important for early civilizations to have seeds that were optimized for this purpose. So in order to make this optimization, people started not only to keep those seeds, but to make genetic crosses between one seed that they found that looked larger, or so, we need larger seeds, and cross it with another one. And this sort of crossing is the conventional way how agriculture has been practiced for, as I said, 10,000 years. However, when you cross one, if you have two parents, of course, like in animal reproduction, female parent and a male parent, and you get you make a cross, then, as you know, is it with us, you introducing a full complement from one parent and the other parent. So the offspring has all the genes from both parents. And so selectively introducing, about 28,000 to 36,000 other genes when you cross one plant and another plant. Here is an example. This here is teosinte. It's a grass in Mexico. And this is believed to be the predecessor of corn. And it looks very different. It's really small, whereas corn, as you know, have it seen in the field, is very tall. And, you see this is a teosinte ear. There are only very few seeds here. So it was possible through conventional breeding to get from here to here. And it turns out nowadays we know we can still make this cross between this unassuming plant and the corn plant and use standard genetics and to demonstrate that actually it's only about half a dozen genes that are necessary to go from here to there. So it's clear that you don't need all these genes to make a difference. So you have to understand a goal of introducing a trait is really to narrow down the number of genes that exist to just a few, so that you readily can add this desirable genetic information. So the answer is to make this a selective approach instead of conventional crossing is something that we call biotechnology. So biotechnology is a new form of breeding that hasn't existed for 10,000 years. It is just about since the early 70s that we were able to clone genes, and about 10 years later it became possible also to clone genes or introduce genes into plants. So conventional breeding, I think, will in the future not anymore sufficient to cope with the time that is necessary to make improvement with crops. So I think for people that don't like it or like it, I think there is just no choice for us to then to use a combination of conventional breeding and gene transfer to produce new traits. Of course, if you want to introduce a new trait or a gene into a crop, you first have to discover a gene that has a benefit for the crop. So gene discovery is very important, and biotechnology is a process by which you can introduce genes into plants. And what is one of the remarkable things with plants, which we can't do easy with animals, is that it's easy to make stem cells from plants and use those to put the DNA in, and then read, as you see here, that is a little flask, and here is some defined medium in there, and you see a little plantlet growing there. And so this is the process that is used to make genetically modified organisms or genetically modified plants. So you take the DNA and you introduce this into a few plant cells that have totipotency in terms of forming all the organs that a plant has. And that is regenerated. And that was a major breakthrough in agriculture, that this became possible. So, what does this new technology provide us? As it allows us to pick the gene we want to use, instead of all the 28,000 genes that normally one parent would have that would come from normal crossing, okay? It allows us to safeguard our food supply. Because I will bring some examples so that you just don't have to speculate what that means. It allows the specific problems to be addressed that I mentioned earlier. Think about water. It has not been yet really realized. All the crops that are out there that are regulated don't have yet addressed the problem of water supply. It's still something to be done. There have been genes that have been discovered that allow a plant to sustain drought for a certain period of time and then resume growth. So that is an example of what we have to do to address the water supply. And if you just think about, 1,000 liter water per pound of grain, we really, if you could reduce that just by 10%, that would save a lot of water. Another one is, I give you another example. As you know, you have seen these rice paddies where rice is cultivated. And so this is underwater. If you're in the Philippines, you see the terraces, it has been for thousands of years, has that practice been. It's the major threat to climate change. Well, now you are looking, you didn't know that. Why? Because this practice of cultivating rice underwater generates a bacteria, or not generates bacteria, it allows bacteria to cultivate that produce methane. Now methane is a gas that is worse than the CO2 that we are producing with our cars out there. in terms of the ozone layer. It is about 20 times worse in destroying the ozone layer, which is important for protecting our Earth on sun exposure. You know, I mean, it's going to be difficult to change that. It has nothing to do with genetic engineering. I'm only telling you that some of the practices that have to be addressed. Another one, of course, is there are many pests out there that reduces agricultural production. And also an important aspect, I know this will come later on, is how we can prevent weeds to take over our crops. So the application of herbicides has been a very important strategy in terms of increasing the amount of crops that we can produce. Now let's look to a few examples of that have been the early uses of biotechnology in crops. What you see here is the stem of a corn plant. This is normal and this does not look normal. And it does not look normal because there is an insect called European corn borer, ECB, that can tunnel through the stem. And when that happens, of course, the plant gets damaged. Now, what has been the practice for many years is that farmers, organic farmers do still today, they take bacteria that have a gene that produces a protein. When ingested by these insects die. And these bacteria are sprayed on the plant to prevent the insect from damaging the plant. And because it has no genetic engineering involved, you just take the bacteria, and spray that. People are under the impression this is organic food. Okay. Now, the scientists in the lab thought, this bacteria is clever to have a gene or protein that could defend the plant. Let's take the gene out of this bacterium and put it directly into the crop. Why would that be better than spraying the bacteria? Very simple. So if you spray the bacteria and it rains, it's washed away. And if it sits outside of the stem, the protection is not ideal. But if the gene is expressed throughout the development of the plant and the protein is made, you you prevent this damage. Now, there is one other thing that I want to tell you about it. People really think, well, it's not really good to do this, but it's enormous damage, at least in these regions where this occurs. I once, when I was at the graduation of my son, there was one of the students, the father was a farmer from the Midwest, from Nebraska. Said, are you using this BT maize? No, she said. Why should I? We don't have that problem here in Nebraska. But if you had something against corn rootworm, which is another pest, then I would take it. And another thing I can tell you, recently a study was done in the Midwest in the US to look at the extent of use of BT corn among the farms. And it turns out that many farms didn't use this, they just used regular corn or BT-free corn. But they didn't have any damage. And the reason for this is because the other farmers, they grew the BT corn, the others benefited from it. It has nothing to do that these crops are mingling or not. It's just that bringing down the pest to a certain level affects everybody. Another one, yeah, I mean, this is about the yield reduction that occurred, and you know, it's for a farmer, this is business. See, this is why people really don't care about this, because it's no use to them. You know, what I mean, this is what we call an input trade, because it's input in terms of costs that are required to produce the crops. It would be an output trade. It was something good for people. I mean, people would really love it. But it's an input trade. Yeah, so this are some of the other points to be made. I want to make one more point about BT corn that most people don't know about. When the damage occurs with this insect, particularly in the ears of corn, where the seeds are, and the damage occurs there, they are infected by a fungus. And this fungus makes a substance called fumonisin, and this is a toxic substance for people. So people that eat this corn, you know, I have it all listed here. You can read it yourself. Can all sorts of things, you know, including cancer. And it's particularly bad in developing countries, like in Africa. There are long-term studies that have shown that the level of toxin that arises from these fungal infections is quite significant. I don't say that people had anticipated this benefit, but it certainly was one of the benefits that came out that was good for people. So first I said it was a benefit for the farmers to increase the yield, but because you don't have the toxin in the corn that is produced, that has direct an impact on people. So that would be an output trade. So because of this benefits from biotechnology, at least for the production, you have a steady increase of planting transgenic crops worldwide. This only goes to 2000, but it has continued to grow. And this just is a graph to show, you know, this is not only corn, but also cotton. So in respect to BT cotton, this BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a bacterium that had the gene that gave you insect resistance. Particularly in China, where cotton required sometimes 6 times to spray insecticides. After introduction of BT cotton, whole hospitals have been closed because the farmers that were spraying had a high incidence of leukemia. But it was from the chemical insecticide instead of using the BT cotton. So it's actually, this is a very clear effect of the benefit for those people, I mean, that have to deal with the crop production. Yeah, here I have some additional numbers on the major crops. I don't know whether that is well to see, but it's just reiterating the amount of land that is used for transgenic crops. As you can see here, soybean is the leader. And one reason that is the case, you know, corn is a very tall plant. So even if you had weeds, it's not such a problem as it was with soybeans. Soybeans are, you know, maybe that tall. This is about the same height that the weeds have. So if weeds crowd the field, the sun cannot get to the soybeans, as effectively as here when you have clean rows. So a herbicide that selectively prevents the growth of weeds and allows the crop plant to have an advantage to grow have been a major improvement in terms of soybean yields. The amount of soybean that can now be produced in terms of particular arable land is much more than it was 10, 15 years ago. Can you imagine soybeans are now one of our major export items in the US because China is buying the soybeans from the US. Because you have the increased development of China in terms of industrialization, and people there, as soon as they have more money, their desire is to have animal meat. And to have the animal meat, you need the soybeans for the production. So anyway, here in terms of soybeans, you see where it is produced. The US is a major producer of soybeans, and Brazil and Argentina as well. And today, you can see how much, I have to get a little bit on the side here, you see how much is genetically modified. In the US, about 85% of the soybeans are modified. In Argentina, nearly 100%. Brazil is a little bit lower. So what is meant with this particular gene that is used here, this gene is, for most of these transgenic plants, is from a bacteria. And it was an ingenious idea of the scientists that came up with this. As I said earlier, you have to first discover the gene before you can modify the plant. Now, the herbicide in question, there's different herbicides, is called glyphosate. You know this under the name of Roundup Ready. Glyphosate is a herbicide that binds to an enzyme. I call it just EPSPS. You don't have to worry about of its full name. But it is an enzyme that is important for the synthesis of certain essential amino acids. These are amino acids that are in proteins that we cannot make. We call these amino acids also, as chemists, we call them aromatic amino acids. We can't make them. Plants can make these amino acids, but also bacteria. And so if we put this herbicide that particular binds to an enzyme that these plants and bacteria make, then of course the plant wouldn't survive. So how do you make that resistant? Of course, the normal enzyme in plants wouldn't work, because then you kill also the crop. Now, the ingenious idea was, let's look at the plant where we produce the herbicide. Whether we find a microorganism that was clever enough, nature by itself was clever enough how to overcome the binding effects of the herbicide. And indeed, there was a gene found that produced an enzyme that still is fully functional even in the presence of the herbicide. So you could introduce this into plants, and it had a tremendous impact, as I said, for the production of solvents. I can come back later if you have questions about this. Now, if we put in these genes and make proteins that were not known to exist in plants, but let's say in bacteria, well, you know, is it dangerous to eat bacterial protein? Well, we all know, whether we have our steak rare, medium, or well done. And the reason for this is because people like to have it well done if they're afraid of bacteria. They want to, but still the protein would be there. But we're using bacteria for a lot of food products. Cheese, and we're using, for instance, yeast, which is a fungus, to make wine and beer. Nobody would stop you drinking because microorganisms are used for this. So on all these microorganisms, they have a lot of proteins that are not present in plants that would potentially be consumed. And of course, nothing happens. So, okay, that's what I just said. So here another point. You all know that we actually need bacteria to digest the food. I don't want to go into details of that and spoil your dinner. So as long as, here this is one concern that we have to have, as long as bacteria don't produce toxin or allergens, it's okay. And still, this is an aspect that needs to be regulated. We need to make sure that there is no contamination of toxic bacteria. And you probably read in the newspapers on occasions that meat got contaminated with bacteria and that people got sick from it. So we have to ensure that the food supply, that the government provides the safety methods. Now, I tell you what is in America the case. I don't know how it here is in Russia or in other countries. But in the US, we have the Minister of Agriculture called the USDA, Department of Agriculture, that has several responsibilities. It issues permits to transport transgenic events and to carry out field trials. And so there is a process of testing any new transgenic crops before it can at all be released and used. You can't just, as a, let's say, as a university or as a company, make a new transgenic crop and just sell it. It's not allowed. The tests that have to be made before it is allowed are very extensive. So you have to test the crops with animals that they don't get sick, and you have to test it in the environment if these transgenic crops properly perform. So there are certain rules that have to be met. Another agency of the government is called the Food and Drug Administration. So they also regulate, of course, new pharmaceuticals, not only agricultural products. But they require, for instance, toxicity studies. So you can't, you have to first test a transgenic crop whether it has any toxicity to animals or people before it is deregulated. And then you have also the EPA that is really responsible for regulating any chemicals that are released to protect the crops. And because the new crops that have genes in them that act as insecticides, the EPA is concerned with the environmental impact. So you shouldn't have the impression that if there is a transgenic crop out there in the US, for instance, that this was just released by the producer. The government agencies are responsible to regulate this. And there, for instance, was one case I can tell you about. There was a company, a European company, that didn't do the allergen tests. I listed it somewhere. And they asked for deregulation only for the use of animals, but this was just not possible. You know, if you have transgenic crop out there, you know, people will have access to it. And they had to take it from the market. And they had a major fine to meet once it was discovered that people could consume it. So, I mean, we have very strict rules, and I think that is one of the reasons that in the United States, GMOs are much more accepted than in Europe. So another aspect is, of course, many foods that you consume are not the raw crops. Well, I think you have no idea how many products in the supermarket, when you go in there, are derived from maize, from corn. Because the actual compound that is of interest are the carbohydrates and not the rest of it. Not the protein, but the carbohydrates. There are other crops, you're only interested in the oil, as cooking oil, for instance. The carbohydrates are used for a lot of things. So carbohydrates is an important ingredient for sweetening your food. So, for instance, if you drink a soft drink, I mean like Coca-Cola or so, that is sweetened with corn syrup. So there is no protein, even if that was produced by BT corn. That protein is not there anymore. Or take soybeans. You know what soybeans is, used in a lot of food products. That depending on what it is used for, there may be no protein left. Depends on the product itself. So you have to understand that processing of food also fractionates the crops in different components. So not everything, you couldn't be even trace back whether that came from a transgenic crop or not. So, as I said earlier, organic farmers spray bacteria for insect production instead of using chemical insecticides. So, you know, I mean, if you buy organic food, you know, you get the same thing. But you get also the other proteins of the bacteria. And as I said, you know, many food products are already processed foods, and they don't have anything left of the BT protein. So, for instance, as I've shown here with Coke or a cake that uses corn as a sweetener. Well, you know, one reason that there's at all any development of new food products is money, because there are new markets. So what we had before, we have a transition here now. In the early years, you have chemical companies that develop these insecticides, which are really bad, as I told you. Now these companies, you know, what can they do to make money? So they come up with something new that is, you know, using biotechnology. So, and of course, you know, the bad image that has arisen from people that get sick from arsen levels that are in these insecticides, you know, they trying to improve their image by saying, well, we want to be a company that produces something that is healthy to people. So what has happened in the US is that you have many companies, chemical companies, that have acquired seed companies. So seed companies are companies that have for many years already used conventional breeding to make you know, superior crops. And so they have provided the platform for these chemical companies that discovered new genes that are useful for these crops. They enable them to sell the seeds to the farmers. So there has been, as a consequence of all this research that has taken place to look for benefits for people in terms of the amount of food that can be produced and also of healthy food. What has happened, you have a change in the industry, in the markets. Well, we're going to be done pretty soon, I guess. So there has been a consolidation in the business. What I would like to cover at the end now here, let's look to some of the issues. What should we be concerned with transgenic crops? And you see here a picture, where in the developing countries people are hesitant to accept this. So one of the issue is, so if you put a gene into a target plant and it's incorporated in its genome, it becomes one of the many genes that are in the genome. So what if this plant produces a pollen with the transgene and it lands on another plant? It would spread this gene. Like, for instance, wouldn't you be concerned? Yeah, I mean, you may be right. It's great to have herbicide-tolerant plants, but what about, would that not make a transgenic wheat? Would the transgene not be jumping into weeds or spread some other ways? Now, I can tell you that plants have developed the way that you can't cross different species. That's very difficult. So there is no worry that a gene can be, by normal crossing, get into another species. But it still could go and be ending up in another non-transgenic plant of the same species. So what sort of precautions are taken? Now, one is when farmers in the US grow transgenic corn, they're obligated to grow a certain amount of non-transgenic plants as well. It's like a ring that you make around your field of non-transgenic plants. The purpose of this is to strike a balance between the transgenic plants and the non-transgenic plants. And in addition, if there is any pollen that from a transgenic plant, it would come to a plant that is still on the field. It's not somewhere else. Another one is important, the farmers. So if you grow, let's say, BT corn on your field, at least for 2 years in a row, and you don't have any corn borers, ECBs around, European corn borers, why would you pay the extra money for buying the transgenic crop? Farmers provide a natural balance to not use transgenic crops unless they have to. And that provides a balance that you use non-transgenic crops as well. As I said, there is a large proportion in the Midwest that grows non-transgenic crops, and they still have the benefit. So money is one reason. So we call this ring around a non-transgenic a refuge. Of course, another aspect is, the weeds could develop resistance because you spray, let's say, the Roundup Ready year after year. It's not so much the gene that lands on another plant, but it is, let's say, the constant use of the herbicide that then leads weeds to become resistant. Similar like with antibiotics, you know, when you use too many antibiotics, you develop resistance against the antibiotics, okay? So, well, you know, it's certainly a concern. But what happened in case of Roundup is that the type of resistance that has arisen in wheats is very different to the one that crops have. So you can, I mean, the same applies to the development of new antibiotics. You have to develop new strategies in the future that will protect you against losing this advantage. And as I said earlier, there is an economic incentive for farmers to use non-transgenics in off years. And that really happens. So I guess, you know, I guess you have enough questions so that I can get to the answers then. Before I do, let me just summarize a little bit what I said today to you. We are in an area where there are more and more genes discovered with an understanding their function. And that has stimulated the development of new plant varieties. You know, there is a technology in the life sciences that allows us now to sequence genomes, entire genomes. And that leads to discovery of new genes and their functions. These varieties allow us to change cultivation practices and generate healthier animal feed. That's the main concern, because there is this preference for animal protein. And I think it's still early in this, so there have been not that many products out there. So plant biotechnology at the same junction as when the first PC came out. Therefore, the challenges for producers and consumers are very similar. There's one last note that I want to add. It was a question I had from the newspaper earlier today. And what my opinion is on the attitude of the European countries towards genetically modified organs. As you know, there is a lot of fear in Europe in the consumption of genetically modified foods. And I think one of the reasons is, as I said earlier, the first products that came out are really more helpful to farmers than the consumer. The consumer, you know, hadn't had any benefit from it. That was very different for animal biotechnology. So out of the, let's say, 300, I guess now, 200, 300 genetically modified products that are deregulated in Europe, 99% are proteins for health benefits. Like, you know, you all know that if you have diabetes, we need a supply of insulin. So to get that insulin, it's not anymore on the slaughterhouse and, you know, and isolate the insulin by chromatography and so on. No, it is produced by cells that have been engineered to have a gene from humans that makes insulin. Nobody says anything about that. Or another one, interferon. I don't know if you've heard of the word before. Interferon is a protein that if you're really sick, for instance, it is used for some liquid cancer. Like, you know, if you had leukemia and you have to take interferon, nobody would complain about it, that it is produced from genetically engineered cells. Or, you know, there are other examples of it. I don't want to continue like this. What I want to point out is if people see that there is an important benefit from them, I think the fear for genetically engineered organisms will fade away. So here are some of the credits. You know, of course, I used some of the pictures here from the web, like everybody else does. A lot of the worldwide production I got from the World Watch Institute, Lester Brown. And that's it. Thank you very much.